I know that. But just by placing on the altar, I'm not too sure about that. That then the altar becomes a means of sanctification in itself.
Only during the service.
Oh, yeah, okay. So during
the proximity during the service.
So the argument would be that the Word of God and prayer then sanctifies it on the altar or near the altar in the divine service.
Yeah, I think an Orthodox who is fluent in Lutheran could probably say that.
Yes, that's a Lutheran spin.
But it might not be the natural language of the Orthodox.
No. When it's not a matter of language; it's a matter of realities always, and that's what I'm interested in. And you see how I'm hedging up here, because a lot of our battles are basically word battles and definition battles. Always when we engage in this kind of cross communication, we need to make sure what realities we're dealing with, rather than just labels and categories. We'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Okay. New topic, the second commandment. Now, I've already dealt with much of this, so I will jump the first part there. Remember the question of the rabbi, what's God's greatest gift to his people? Hashem, the name. Now, yesterday, fortuitously, we were able to deal with most of this. I'd like to pick up the discussion towards the end of the page there. Self-introduction. Have you got that diamond dot point there? About the second dot point up from the bottom of page 9. Okay, one of the most remarkable things that happens at Mount Sinai is God's self-introduction to his people. Now, the way I see it, if I wanted to put it in, and I like putting it in picture terms, it's as if God reaches out with his word from the cloud and says, "Hello, I'm Yahweh." He introduces himself. And by introducing himself, he gives his holy name. And here, this is remarkable. What you'd expect from a pagan background is that he gives his name exclusively to which group? The priests. But he gives his name to who? All Israel. And that means men, women, children, babies. The whole show. And that means that he's interested not just in sanctifying a little holy group, but he gives his name, his most holy name, to share his holiness with all his people. So he gives his personal name, and at the same time, he gives his commitment to people. Because, you see, I could play games with you and say, okay, come up to Chris and say, "Hello, I'm John. How are things going?" And you get the impression from what I say that I want to be what to you? Friend. And then you're disappointed when you find out that next time you see me, I don't recognise you. Or next time you say, "Hello, John," I'm very formal with you. Okay? The giving of the name without commitment to the person is of little value. Because what God does is not just give his name, give access to himself, but on a permanent basis by that act of commitment. You see the way it goes? So he gives forever thereafter. Now, one of the most important discussions on the holy name occurs in Exodus 33. This is quite a large section, and I'd like to take you through that. Exodus 33, verse 12 following, up to 34:7, where you get one of the most remarkable, unparalleled passages in the whole of the Old Testament. Okay, if I said to you, where in the Old Testament does God preach himself? And preach himself evangelically, this is it. Here you have God's self-preaching, the preaching of himself and his grace. And it's to Moses, and it's in the heart of what the most terrible of all terrible incidents in Exodus, the incident of the golden calf. God shows amazingly he preaches his name. But let's get an idea of the flow here. Dwight, could you start off reading at verse 12 of Exodus 33?
Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people. You have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight."
Just stop there. You found favour in my sight is the word hain, grace. The only person who finds favour with God is Moses. Now what does it mean that Moses finds favour with God? Is that he has access to God's grace favour. He has a relationship of grace with God. What in practical terms does that mean? Always think practically. If Moses had found favour with God, and God has told him that you found favour in my sight, what does that mean practically?
He has access. He can speak to him and enter his presence.
And speak to him and do what by speaking to him? Just say hello to him. Ask for favours. And if it's grace, it means not just what he deserves, but anything. Right? Grace. Okay? Gifts. Whatever gifts he wants, God says, okay, you can find favour with me. Now, what's happened beforehand is that you have the intercessions of Moses. The first three have occurred. God promises not to destroy the people. God refuses to accept Moses' immolation, his self-sacrifices. And God says, okay, now I'll send my angel to take you to the promised land. Now what's the problem? Moses doesn't just want an angel to lead the people. He wants God's presence. Now see how it goes, okay? I found favour in your sight. You said, lead the people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. He can't do it by himself. Now he wants to push God here. What God's intimated that he won't go with his people. Keep reading.
Verse 13.
Yes.
Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people.
Just stop there. So if I have found favour, if you're pleased in me, okay, not teach me your ways, it's singular. Teach me your way. Okay, teach me the way you're going to treat me and the people. The way you are going to lead me. Okay, he wants God's way, and he says, hint, hint. And to do that, if I'm going to continue to find favour, this is necessary. And hint, hint, remember that this is your people. It's not my people. I'm not responsible for taking these blighters to the promised land. These are your people. Hint, hint. Okay, keep going.
Verse 14, and he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest.
Now, can we stop there? Presence, pamim. This is what Moses wants. But God is ambiguous. Because the with, just bracket out the with you. My presence will go along, and I will give you singular rest. One of the problems with English use is that we don't know whether it's singular or plural. Now, what is God promising? Is he promising his presence to his people? Is he promising rest to his people? No, he's promising, well, he hasn't said who he's going to go along with. It could be Moses or the people, but he's promised rest to Moses. Now, notice the connection between three things. Presence, name, rest. That's the verb here. I will give you menecha. Now, Moses jumps at the window of opportunity. Keep going.
Verse 15.
Yes.
And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight? I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?
Okay, can you see what he does? He takes God's promise to him and he extends it to the people. And what's his argument basically? I belong to the people belong to me, you can't separate us. And what's going to make us different from all the nations of the earth is the presence of God with his people. Just take notice of that. What makes Israel unique is the presence of God with them in the divine service. Now, keep going.
Verse 17. And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken I will do. For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name.
But I know you by name, meaning that's a very, very intimate relationship. You found favor, he grants this request. Amazing grace. And now comes, Moses plays his, not quite the trump card, but his second last one. This is just too good. So he's going for broke now. He's on a roll. Keep going.
Verse 18. Moses said, please show me your glory.
Now just stop there. What is Moses asking for? Show me your glory? Show me your face. Glory, face. I want to have a visual theophany. Show me, make me see in Hebrew, your glory. Show me your face. Wow, that's a bit daring. Now keep going.
Verse 19. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live.
Just stop there. God doesn't either answer or refuse the request, but instead of offering to show his glory, he says, I'm going to parade what in front of you? My goodness. I'm going to parade so you can see all my goodness. And how is he going to parade the goodness in front of him? By proclaiming his name. Now you have an idiom here in Hebrew, to call on the name of the Lord. Everywhere else this is used for human beings calling on the name of God, but here God calls on his own name. So God says, I will parade my goodness before you. How? By preaching, proclaiming my own name. So he parades his goodness verbally in front of him. And then he says, I will be gracious to whom I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and compassion on whom I will have compassion. Now, very often that's misunderstood in the Calvinist sense. Now, I will have mercy on some whom I have mercy, others I won't. Now, this is a Hebrew way of indicating the superlative degree. Superlatively, good, better, best. Now, Hebrew doesn't have that, but it does it by repetition. And then it is most holy, and holy, well that's English, but it is holy of holies. So you have a song, but what's the best song? The Song of Songs. You see the repetition? Or instead of Hebrew saying God is superlatively holy, the angels say holy, holy, holy. You see the repetition? God is supremely, utterly holy. Now, I will have compassion on whom I have compassion means I will be utterly compassionate. I will be utterly gracious. I will be utterly merciful. At a superlative degree. Keep going now.
Verse 21. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. While my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen.
Okay, I've already spoken about this. Common body language, showing face means showing interest, favour, acceptance, all that kind of body language. Showing a back means rejecting, normally. But if God's backside is goodness, what is his face? supremely good. If God's backside is utter grace and mercy, then his front is supremely, but also overwhelmingly so. No one can see my face and live. Why is it? No. Why is goodness intolerable, unbearable for us? I would have thought goodness would be completely attractive, beautiful, acceptable. Sometimes you get an inkling of this. If you are in the presence of somebody who is just so good, how do you feel? Terrible. Huh? And with God then, oddly, God's goodness is just overwhelming. Because what do we wear when, it's like light. Bright light is just too much. It's too dazzling. If we who are evil are overwhelmed by goodness. And so God has to veil his goodness, package his goodness to us, hide his goodness for us, so that he packages it, if you like, in human terms. You do that all the time with your kids. You can work out how you do it with your kids. In quite concrete forms, the way that is accessible, available to them. Now, this is God's proposal about what he's going to do. Now, in the beginning of the next chapter, he does what he promises to do. Now, the key here is that he parades his goodness by preaching his name. So the focus here is on name and the connection between name and presence. And notice then also, then rest here is hovering in the background. First 3 commandments sort of connected here. Keep going now.
34:1. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready by the morning, and come up in the morning to Mount Zion. Present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite that mountain." So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first. And he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord.
Just stop there. He descends even up top of the mountain in a cloud, veiling his glory. Notice he's showing his glory, but he's showing his glory in a veiled form, and he shows his glory by preaching his name, proclaiming his name, the Lord. Now comes the actual words of the formal proclamation. And this is a very important foundational event. Keep going.
Verse 6. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation.
Just working backwards, what's the basic contrast there between God's grace and his visitation of iniquity? God's grace goes to how many generations? Thousands. So God's grace is basically limitless. On the other hand, God's judgment is what? At the most 4. But 3rd generation. Why 3rd or 4th generation? It's the people that a person comes into contact with, his life, his family. So just think of the normal lifespan of a person. Let's say I'm an alcoholic or drug addict. It's going to affect me, my wife, it's going to affect my children, it's definitely going to affect my grandchildren, and if I live long enough, if it doesn't get me, the most it'll be my great-grandchildren. And how will God then limit my iniquities? By death. Just the normal process. So you have the contrast here between God's grace, which is utterly limitless, and God's judgment, which is limited and is aimed at limiting evil. Secondly, and I'm working backwards here, with the most difficult part, what's the idea of visiting iniquity? Many translations give here punish. I will punish the third and fourth generation. What's the basic picture of visiting iniquity? And it's very, very obvious and commonsensical. There's nothing terribly difficult about it.
Is it original sin? That
No,
kind of a...
no, it's much easier than that.
Okay.
Look, if you do evil,
Evil's going to be done to you.
well, not be done to you is that that's going to have evil consequences. Look, if I, let's say, if I commit adultery, it's going to affect me. If I take drugs, it's going to affect me. All the nature of evil is that it has evil consequences. Most obviously, it has evil consequences for the person that I sin against. Less obviously, it has evil consequences for myself. Now, you all know the law of karma, which it has most people in Australia who are Christians believe in the law of karma. And they do so because they've never been taught properly in the Old Testament. Now, the law of karma is what? What you do to others will be done to you, and there's an exact equivalence, an absolute balancing. So the evil that you do will be done to you. On the reverse is the good that you do will be returned to you, or boomerang back on you. Now, what's the difference between the way the law of karma deals with evil and the way God deals with evil? Well, that's karma. That's karma. That's karma. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. That's classical karma talk.
He forgives.
Even before he forgives. Even with people whom he doesn't forgive.
He limits the impact.
He
of sin.
limits the impact of sin. Now, this is utterly remarkable. He limits the impact of sin. Look, if we really suffered the full consequences put it another way, if all human beings on earth suffered the full consequences of all the evil that they did, what would happen?
Die immediately.
Not only, yes,
The earth was, there would be nothing here.
there would be no human beings, the earth would be destroyed. Chaos would be unleashed. So God remarkably limits the impact of evil. He controls it, manages. Now, why is it that he limits the impact of evil? What's his aim? Is his aim to punish people?
To save everyone.
And to save everybody and to save societies? It is to teach people, by consequence, so that they will recognize their evil, repent and seek forgiveness. And God teaches in three ways, says C.S. Lewis beautifully. He says he either uses the whisper, or the telling off, or the stick. The little whisper is the whisper of conscience. If you don't listen to the voice of conscience after you've done evil, then he will teach you with his stick. No, he'll use somebody else to tell you off. He'll rebuke you in some way through and if you don't accept rebuke, then he'll use his stick on you, which is the actual punishment. No, the events. He'll let you suffer the consequences of your actions. Look, and you can see this as pastors. You can see this happening all around you if you get close to your people and see what's happening in families. And you can see it most dramatically in the cases where you get problems in marriages, sexual problems, the effect of sexual issues on the couple, family, children, grandchildren. That's negatively, but you can also see remarkably that children coming out of that mess escape karma. Haven't you all seen that? God in his grace limits the evil, intervenes to limit evil. Now, okay, let me take the whole passage then through fairly quickly. Number one, notice that God first of all preaches his name. So the passage begins with a twofold announcement of his name. Yahweh, Yahweh. Please excuse my use of the holy name. The Lord, the Lord. Okay, why two? You can have all sorts of reasons, but it's very emphatic. Okay, he gives his name. He proclaims his name, and now he gives, if you like, he preaches what he makes available to his people through his name. Okay? What can the Israelites, what gifts do the Israelites access when they call on him by name? So notice the idiom. The normal idiom for calling on God is Quara V'Shem Adonai. Quara V'Shem Adonai. Now, God calls on the name of the Lord. He preaches his name to them in order to give them the precedent so that they in turn can call on the name of the Lord. A very strange reversal. This is the only place in the whole Bible where God calls on his own name. He preaches his name, proclaims his name, so that they in turn can call on him by name. Then this is followed by a group of adjectives which give us, there's three sets of them, which give God's personal credentials. What kind of a God is the Lord? Well, he is gracious, or compassionate and gracious. He is slow to anger, great in mercy and faithfulness. Okay, we could spend a lot of time. Compassion, grace, slow to anger, long-suffering, and he is rich in keseth, mercy, loving kindness. Now, you open your Psalter, and almost every psalm picks up one of those words and claims these gifts from God. And then then after his proclamation of his name and the access that they have to him and his personal credentials, the gift from him, he outlines his policy. Remember, Moses had asked God to show him his way. What is the way of the Lord? Okay, here you have the Lord's way. What is the way that he deals with his people? His way of treating his people. Okay, here you have it. God's way is that he keeps mercy for thousands of generations understood. He removes iniquity, rebellion and sin, or he bears iniquity, rebellion and sin. Bearing sin. It's usually translated as translation, but it means literally bear. Nazar avod. He carries, he removes, he bears all kinds of evil. Iniquity, rebellion, sin. Includes every evil. But by no means exempting from guilt. He doesn't excuse guilt. Why? Because he visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generations. So what is his policy? His policy is his ongoing, unlimited generosity to his people up to and beyond 1,000 generations to those who love him. Now just think of it. The blessings that you have received have come to you not just directly from the Lord, but have flown to you from your ancestors. If you, like me, have been blessed by ancestors who have been Christians for hundreds of years, just think of the flow of blessing that you are enjoying. You see, one of the problems that we have, we are open, because we have original sin, we're open to seeing evil in our lives, but we're blind to what is good. have you got any awareness of the blessing that flows to you? Probably most of you come from Christian families, don't you? It'd be interesting for you sometime to look back at your family tree and say, how many generations back have my ancestors loved the Lord? And just think of the blessing that comes from that. And also, if you are faithful and love the Lord, how despite all the trouble that you may have in your family, what still happens? The faith, the God's mercy that comes down from your ancestors to you will flow on to your children. The second thing is that he forgives sins. He doesn't operate by the law of karma. He does visit the iniquities on people, but what does he do with sin iniquity? Instead of making people bear it, he himself takes it on his shoulders and carries it away. We're going to come upon that when we come to the priest, the vestments of the priest. He visits the iniquity, but only in a limited way to the third and fourth generation. Now, don't get it wrong. He doesn't say if somebody sins, if somebody hates the Lord, then children and grandchildren must suffer. This is the limit. If you like, at the most, iniquity will go how far? Third and fourth generation. That's at the most. But in most cases, what's going to happen? It'll be far less than that. But notice that this is limited. This limits the impact of the evil that we do. Thank God for that. And it's only because of that that the world still survives. One other thing, that way God deals with evil is in a strange way. There's two things that the Bible teaches. Is one, God uses evil to destroy evil. And secondly, he brings good out of evil. Right? His judgment is always to right what is wrong, to bring people to their senses so that they repent, so that the wrong that's been done, he can right the wrong. Okay, then notice then the unlimited grace of God and the limited judgment of God, if I can put it that way. Or in terms of judgment, positive judgment is limitless. The punitive or the negative judgment is very, very limited. Notice the disproportionate contrast. Lastly, by means of, in this passage, the Lord authorizes the use of his name to proclaim his grace in preaching and meditation. The use of it in prayer, praise, as happens in the Psalms. If you like, most concretely, in this passage, God authorizes the Psalter. Because the whole Psalter is using God's name to access his compassion, his grace, his faithfulness, his loving kindness, his mercy, but also to ask for justice for yourself and for others, against others. And you can pray that God will visit the iniquity of those who hate him, but not any further than the third or fourth generation. You can pray for God to judge your enemies, or you can ask God to do so. Whether he does so or not is up to him and his grace and mercy, as so often happens in the Psalms. So the whole Psalter, if you like, is built on this passage. I once started going through the Psalter using, in a Bible that I don't usually read, but an old one, with a highlighter, and I tried to highlight all the allusions to this passage that we've been looking at, and I gave up after I got to about Psalm 50. Do you know why? There were just too many. there's hardly a psalm which doesn't either quote this or allude to it directly or indirectly. The Psalms are the use of this. So in this passage, God authorises the use of his name as we find in the Psalter. By the way, this passage is the most frequently quoted passage in the Bible. That's self-proclamation of God. It's quoted more frequently, alluded more frequently to, and referred to indirectly more frequently than any other passage in the Scriptures, which shows you something of its importance. Okay, to put it in good Lutheran terms, here you have God preaching the gospel in the Old Testament in an unparalleled, marvellous way. Any questions now? Yeah.
Which is, he set the pattern in Genesis 3:15.
You better tell people what Genesis 3:15 is.
The seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head.
Yes. That's the first promise. But it's, there's the promise there, but do you know where human beings begin to call on the name of the Lord, first of all? Yes. And who was it? Okay. And it's very interesting, yes. At that time, human beings began to, and it comes after the murder of Cain, Abel, and then you get Seth. Seth also, this is verse 26, Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, look at it, men began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, they began to invoke the name of God in prayer. What's added here that wasn't there? The calling. This gives you some, God here helps people to call on the name of the Lord by giving them not only his name, but all the promises of grace attached to it. And he gives them, authorizes them to use his name where? Which means in the divine service. In his presence, in the divine service. The calling on the name of the Lord began with Seth, and it was then within the family worship, family altar. Now you get the fulfillment of that in the divine service, which is instituted, has been instituted, but hasn't been yet established at Mount Sinai. Anything else on this? Can you see how stupendous this is? Every time I look at this, my heart sort of leaps with joy. It's just so wonderful. And remember too that when Luther, in his very famous Heidelberg Disputation, where he distinguishes between theology of glory, theology of the cross, you can say that that's an exegesis of 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2, the preaching of the cross, and Exodus chapter 33 and 34. Those two things together are the drivers, are the biblical texts for that very famous and very helpful and useful set of theses for the Heidelberg Disputation, very early in Luther's career. Now, it's rather formal there, and it's sort of very academic and abstract, but if you want to see it in its full flowering, you go to marvellous passages in the Genesis commentary and in his John sermons. There may be other places, but that's where I'm aware of. 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, where Paul talks about the preaching of the cross. Now, where we preach Christ and him crucified. I think I've seen that somewhere, haven't I? Larry? You're not listening. We preach Christ and him crucified. Okay. Anything else? Okay, let's have a break. Let's say it's about 10 minutes thereabouts, and then we'll have a run through the third commandment. Or you're getting too tired and can't take any more.
Was Genesis 8?
I was going to say,
Genesis.
pass around list if you will sign it tomorrow, and just mark your yes or your no as far as tomorrow for dinner. And then I've got it all written down. I don't have to try and remember.
Also, a reminder about tonight over at our place again. After dinner, we won't be serving dinner tonight, but we'll have drinks and some snacks beginning at 6 o'clock.
And tomorrow, when we get done with class, our social hour does begin, and then dinner's at 6 o'clock. Tomorrow night.
Proclaims, preaches, is it Quran?
Yes. Yes.
What other?
Qur'an is called.
Yeah. Are there other words?
Cry out. It's
What
verbal.
other Hebrew words? Other Hebrew words for like when does Moses?
Is this going?
No, it's fine.
Last lap of the race for today. The third commandment. We'll see whether we get beyond it. Can we just go, first of all, to Exodus 20 and attend to the exact wording of it is given there. Jim, could you read it for me, please?
Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work.
Just stop there. Labour, do all your work. Labour is agricultural work. Do your work is the idea of craftsman in handiwork. So that there's the two classes of work. There's primary production and secondary production. Agriculture, manufacturer. Yeah, so there's those two kinds. Keep going.
But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
The Lord rested on the seventh day is the verb not Shabbat, but nuach. In the Kal form, rest. Now remember that God had said to Moses, my presence will go and I will give you rest. Same verb. And the noun from that is menucha, rest, which means both a time of rest and a place of rest. Secondly, notice the reach of this commandment. Who's not to do any work? It's not just the members of the immediate family, but also the workers, manservant, maidservant, and notice the next, the animals are part of the family. Nor the alien within your gates. Within your gates means that within your villages, within your communities. The alien is the foreigner. So even people who are not Israelites are given the privilege of resting. Now, we Christians very often misrepresent the Jewish tradition, because we misread the New Testament. And we see, from sort of kindergarten onwards, we have the idea that the Sabbath was an awful burden for the Israelites. And there were so many restrictions, and we see the negative side of it. Now, they couldn't basically do anything, and we caricature the rabbinical limitations on the amount of work that you could do or couldn't do. So we have the idea that the Sabbath was an enormous imposition, an enormous burden for the people of Israel. Talk to the Jews and you get a different message. What's the Sabbath? A holiday, a happy day, the best day, a great gift. Now I want to focus on that element of the gift of the Sabbath and the gift of rest that God provides in the Sabbath. But before I do that, I want to comment on something which has become a feature of modern life. And I guess it's so everywhere in the Western world. I think it's worse here in North America, in the USA, than it is Australia. But basically, most people that I know are workaholics. Now, a workaholic is not just a person who works long hours. You can work long hours and work hard and have 2 jobs and still not be a workaholic. What's a workaholic?
One who never rests.
One who never rests even when they rest.
Have the opportunity.
When they don't rest at night time. And they can't rest at night time. They don't rest when they have meals. They don't rest when they aren't formally working. They don't rest on their holidays. They never rest. And it's not just that their minds are ticking over, but they are never at rest. There's an enormous restlessness which you can sense deep in the souls of people. An unsettledness, a restlessness, an unsteadiness. One of the big problems all the way through Western societies is insomnia, which is a bit of a tip of the iceberg. And people don't keep on working even when they're not working. People never rest. And so, potentially speaking, the preaching on the Sabbath day is very culturally relevant. However, the church has got it wrong again. Because we get people to come to church, and instead of giving them rest, we demand that they become involved. So church becomes just another bit of doing work. Or we demand involvement from people to do this, to do that, and people already overburdened, we add burdens upon burdens by demanding that they do this and that in the church. And we give the impression that holy work is the work that's done in the church and for the church rather than in life. But the worst thing is that for most people, I think in Australia, very few of them experience worship as rest-giving. Is that just in Australia? Something funny is going on here. This workaholism is a kind of idolatry. That's something, we need to be able to tackle it head on, not legalistically, but evangelically. Okay, let me take you then through this commandment. Remember, right at the beginning, and Exodus reminds us of this, that God created human beings for 2 purposes. First of all, he created human beings not to work for him, but to work with him in the order of creation. And secondly, he created human beings to rest with him. Not to rest for him, but to rest with him. So what is the God-given order for human life, which is built into creation? Is 6 days of work and at least 1 day of rest. And Genesis 1 seems to suggest that's part of the divine imprint, the order that God's created human beings. We weren't created just to work non-stop for most of our life and then to rest when we retire. We were created for working and for resting and working and resting with God. The Sabbath day, you won't understand the Sabbath day unless you know something about pagan theology. And it's best expressed in the very famous Babylonian Enuma Elish. This is one of the foundational stories for Babylonian religion. Originally the gods, there were two classes of gods. There were the upper class gods and then there were the worker gods. Now that's what they created. So the big gods created the little gods so that the little gods would do all the work for them. What was the task of the lower class of gods? They were to provide temples and food and drink and entertainment for the upper class gods. Now, whereas the lower class gods were the workers, the upper class gods were the aristocrats. They were the leisure class. They never lifted a finger, they never had to do any work. Okay, that was the original design of the universe. Now, as a result of that, that worked very well. Remember, this is a mythological story, but it basically encapsulates what's deep in pagan religion. The lower class gods got so sick of it that they rebelled. They had the first strike in human history. And the poor big gods were in trouble because their temples were falling apart. They were getting hungry and bored. That was the worst thing. They ran out of clothing. They ran out of all the luxuries that they were used to. So they held a meeting and they negotiated with each other. And finally, the decision was to create human beings. It's interesting that human beings were created out of chaos monster. It says something about human beings. Now, they created human beings for what purpose? To work as slaves for the gods. As temple slaves. As workers for the gods. It sounds like your original capitalism. Human beings were created as workers for God. So, ritual in pagan religions is quite simply the work that human beings do to provide the gods with what they need, their necessities and luxuries. So human beings build a temple because gods need temple. Human beings need statues because gods need means of interacting with them. Human beings adorn the statues with beautiful clothing because the gods like to be well dressed and well presented. Human beings provide food for them, drink for them, provide entertainment for them. Dancing girls and all. Now notice here that in paganism you have the gods being leisured and human beings doing work. Now what's the contrast? Right from the beginning in Genesis, you have a God who does what? Who's a worker. He gets down and dirty. He gets his hands dirty. He creates the world in an ordered world, and he creates the world for human beings, not to exploit human beings, but to authorize them, to bless them, to share his life, his love, his resources with them. Now, seen in that light, the Sabbath is quite remarkable. What's the Sabbath? What does God do by giving Israel a Sabbath? He treats them as if they were aristocracy. Remember in the ancient world who did the work? The slaves, aristocrats were leisure class. God works with his people, God rests with his people, and by giving them a day of rest, he gives them the royal treatment. He gives them time off. He treats them as royalty, as a member, as the aristocracy, who don't have to work all the time. Okay, do you get the basic picture? Now, what's the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a holy day free from work. Now, the picture here is of Israel as God's royal sons. And if you think in terms of a king, together with his court, his royal sons, the sons work together with the Father, but they also rest together with the Father in the Father's house. That's the picture here. What's prohibited is work, just ordinary work, farm work and work at any trade. Notice the contrast with pagan rituals as work for gods. Now, just think how funny the Sabbath is. What's the central, foundational, fundamental ritual of Israel? It's an anti-ritual ritual. All ritual is basically work. What God commands is ritual leisure. So how do human beings benefit from God? How do they honour God best of all? Is by doing nothing. It's through resting, ceasing from work. God in effect says, I don't need your work. I don't need your work. You need my work. So notice the oddity of ritual leisure. The pagans in the ancient world and even early church just couldn't make much sense of this. That the central observance was not an elaborate cult. There's an elaborate cult, but the central ritual is rest, doing nothing. And we very often clutter that up and we think, okay, they rested in order to hold a service or to pray and praise. No, the only requirement for Israel was to take a day off from work. And to take a day off, not just an ordinary break, but it's a holiday, a true holiday, a holy day, holy rest. There are two kinds of Sabbaths in the Old Testament. First of all, there's the weekly Sabbath, and there's four of them every month. So every seventh day is the Sabbath day. Now just look at the arrangement of the week. I don't know whether you've ever considered this. You have the week divided into two parts, 1 to 6, and then you have 7. What's significant about the location of the day of rest? It's the end of the week. Therefore what? It's the goal of the week. You work in order to rest. We rest in order to work. God established this. You work in order to rest. What's God's goal? Not just for every week, but for the whole of human history.
Eternal.
He works with human beings in order to provide rest as the goal. Now, there's two kinds of Sabbaths. There are these weekly Sabbaths. That's what you normally think of. But then there are the extraordinary Sabbaths, and interestingly enough, there are 7 extraordinary Sabbaths. This means extraordinary days of rest. And which are they? They are the festive Sabbaths. The first day of unleavened bread, that's the day after the Passover night. Mind you, that's very sensible, because after you've been staying up all night, what do you want to do?
Rest.
So the first day of unleavened bread, the 7th day of unleavened bread, the end of the week. You can do work during the week there, but the last day is a rest day. Pentecost is a single day, it's a day of rest. New Year's Day, which is the first day of the 7th month, the beginning of the new agricultural year. Now here you get the reversal of it. Normally speaking, you get this pattern, but when it comes, that's the religious pattern, but the secular pattern is that you rest when at the beginning of the year. It's there's something a bit odd there. And then on the same 7th month, they rest on the Day of Atonement. That's a very, very absolute day of rest. There's further restrictions there. And then you have the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the whoopee time. It's equivalent to our Christmas season in terms of holiday time. It's the end of the agricultural year. The harvests come in. farmers are free to leave the farm for at least a week and to take a good holiday. And so you have an 8-day holiday, and the first and last day of Tabernacles is a rest day, a Sabbath day. Okay, that's the formalities of it. Any questions? Yes?
Is there a variation in the temple service?
Yes. But no, nothing is basically changed, just you get additional offerings. Right? The Sabbath day has all the regular offerings, and then you have additional ones. You're basically the same ritual, but more of the same. And likewise, the festive offerings, you have the same offerings. Then as well as the normal offerings, you have a sin offering, which is an offering for purification added to it, and additional offerings. You can see the schedule of sacrifices in 2 places, Exodus, not Exodus, there's in Leviticus and in Numbers.
So were these perceived as everybody gets a day off, but the priests who have a lot more?
Yeah, they didn't have the day off. They kept on working when everybody else was resting. Remember, Jesus makes a great deal of that. When in John, where he says, even the priests work on the Sabbath day. God works all the time. God doesn't rest on the Sabbath. In fact, God does his most important work on the Sabbath. Why do human beings rest? They rest in order to be the recipients of God's work. Once again, you get the divine service thing being reversed. Instead of the worship being work for God, you rest so that God can do his work on you and in you and through you. So there's a close connection here between work and rest. God does his work in you so that for the rest of the week you can work together with God in your station and vocation in the order of creation. Now, it's in connection with the third murmuring of Israel because of the terrible food that was being delivered to them in the desert when they wanted to go back to Egypt, because the food was so good there that God gave them first of all the quails and then the manna. And in connection with the manna, he instituted the Sabbath. He gave them the gift of the Sabbath. Sabbath as a gift. Notice it comes as a gift before it becomes a demand. And it's remember then on the 6th day, he gives double the amount of manna so that they don't have to even gather the manna on the 7th day. To dramatize that if they didn't work 7 days, they wouldn't suffer because of it in terms of their livelihood. Now, what's the reason for their rest? There are 2 reasons given. First of all, God rests after 6 days